Bienvenido a la isla.
On Easter Island, the centuries live side by side. Beyond the hula girls and flower lays, the welcoming songs and smiles, lie the relics of ancient, half-glimpsed mysteries. Here, a visitor from the present, I set foot on the endless continent of the past. Here, like an absent-minded tourist or a refugee fleeing disaster, the past has left its luggage. Images carved on stone, hollowed trumpet rocks of long-forgotten youth. Stranded in time, the celebrated figures, or moai, still seem to be awaiting the return of the people who abandoned them.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There were 6, and one is
originally,
missing.
yes.
Is there any project to restore it?
No, it's broken into a great many pieces, and can't be
And
reerected.
the one on the other side is eroded to almost nothing.
Yes, that one too was found in the sea.
It was found in the sea.
Like caverns under the sea, much of the island's history lies hidden. Yet it holds a clear and ominous warning for the citizens of a larger island, Earth itself.
Lost in the immense solitudes of the Pacific, 1,100 miles from the nearest inhabited island and 2,300 miles from the South American coast, Easter Island is the Earth's loneliest habitation and the most puzzling, a microcosm of the human story lost in silence. Mute celebrities of history, the great figures of Easter Island are witnesses to a past they cannot describe, yet a scale model of our own world lived and died here. Like unborn children, some statues were left blind by the world that conceived them. They are the cloned images of a civilization that finally destroyed its own habitat and died trying to repeat itself. In the quarries of Rano Raraku, unfinished effigies sleep out the centuries, awaiting slow dissolution in the wind and rain. But the voices of the living are no less oblivious to their past. Now subjects of Chile, the people of Pascua, as the island is called in Spanish, or Rapa Nui in Polynesian, have been overwhelmed by Western ways. They are hardly aware that for at least 1,000 years, isolated on a triangular island barely 9 miles by 13, their ancestors developed a unique miniature civilization with its own complex social forms, religions, technology, and written language. After rediscovery by the Dutch navigator Roger Wien on Easter Sunday, 1722, Western culture came like a blow. Peruvian slave traders and Yankee whalers raided the island. Smallpox swept the inhabitants. By 1877, from a population that once may have numbered 20,000, only 111 stunned survivors remained. Of earlier history and catastrophes, they knew almost nothing. But almost certainly the first settlers were lost seafarers from the islands of Polynesia far to the west.
When people are enclosed in a finite world like here, do you think that automatically they begin to dream about out of this world things that are impossible, which means gigantism?
There is something that I wonder. Do we have any idea of what the island looked like when the first people came in it?
Kainga mata porito mahuna tera kenua ako. Taipeu te pete matu kainga mata mai haira te uringa hanga. Aue nuai, aue koroe, aue ngakope. Kainga mata po urito aue mahuna tera kenua ako.
In a few of the island's songs, one can hear, across time and the encircling seas, the sound of a more distant voice, the echo of a deeper past. Kept purer by long isolation from other cultural influences, the earliest songs have been preserved only by the efforts of a few scholars and amateur enthusiasts. Among them, Dr. Ramon Campbell, the resident physician, who plays his recordings for Captain Cousteau.
It's amazing that I don't find any similarity with the Tahitian songs I heard.
Absolutely. For me, it was a great surprise when I recorded these chants that year, that first time. But I found it was absolutely different from Polynesian chants and music. I haven't found in no island in the Pacific something so. The analysis scientific of this music sounds that the music has more influence of Indian, and the poetry, the poems, from the old poems of China.
Among the islanders themselves, no more than a handful still can remember the songs and sing them. For more than a century, explorers and anthropologists have tried to unravel the complex mysteries of Easter Island's cultural origins.
Tonga y Fiji es el principal para poblar las Marquesas. Pero de las Marquesas,
From the University of Santiago, Professor Jorge da Silva traces the probable pathways across the islands of Polynesia. The first migrants, says Professor da Silva, arrived perhaps as early as the 1st century, and certainly not later than King Hotamatua's band in the 7th. Starting at the Marquesas, from which Hawaii, Tahiti, and New Zealand also were populated, it is probable that the first settlers were seeking another landfall when winds drove them to Easter Island and left them there forever trapped. Fortunately, they had with them a few small animals and plants to found a colony. Petroglyphs of the canoes that brought them are described by anthropologist Robert Kroll.
Well, this is a petroglyph of a double-hulled, high-sterned Polynesian voyaging canoe, which was discovered during Dr. Malloy's expedition in 1974. I'll just briefly outline with my fingers what this petroglyph shows. The canoe starts here. This is the hull of the canoe. And these lines going up here represent the high stern of the canoe where the chieftain, the king, or Ariki rode.
Dr. William Malloy, noted authority on Easter Island, tells Cousteau the statues are not as stylized as one might think.
Well, within the framework of the stylized form, it's the local nose. The local people are like this.
You think the people of the country look like that?
Very much. That is, the statues, in a sense, are sort of a caricature or highly stylized, but they're highly stylized representations of the local people. And you can find many islanders who are very similar to this in appearance.
Now, there are statues all over the place here near the factory. How many did you guess there are here?
Oh, I think about 260.
260
that are visible now.
Here in the quarry?
That's right. A great many more buried below the surface. Many, many more.
Why below the surface?
The talus, of course, has gradually fallen down here and covered up a great many. This is a good example of one stage in the carving process. The statues were first carved by carving a trench around the block that was to become the statue. Then the upper part of the statue was carved, and eventually they carved the underside, leaving the statue supported on a long, narrow keel, which was eventually picked away.
How did they do that?
And
flat.
simply, well, the bottom part was filled with earth and rubble. And then small areas were taken away and picked away and replaced until finally the statue was freed and it was ready to move down the slope to its hole in the ground.
Not gods, but family portraits of ancestors conveying mana or spiritual power The great moai, often 15 tons of stone, were placed on sledges of wood, then plentiful, and pulled to their sites by cables of twisted fiber.
You get the impression here, particularly in this area, of a tremendous population. People frantic to use every last square meter of land.
Because of what?
Because of overpopulation.
How many were there here?
This is a very difficult question to answer, but certainly many thousands.
Many thousands?
Many thousands.
On this
small island.
The questions multiply. What ravaged this once fertile and wooded island? What purpose required the carving of an estimated 1,000 giant figures? What compulsion would throw them down? Seeking clearer answers, Cousteau summoned his exploration team, headed by son Philippe. On the north side of the island, near a statue restored by Thor Heyerdahl, Philippe and his companions set up base camp. Here, on the island's only beach, King Hotumatua and his Polynesians are believed to have landed in the late 7th century. Bringing only a few chickens and plants, Hotumatua's people survived for more than 1,000 years. Though Philippe's party plans a shorter stay, it brings in a wide array of rafts, motors, air tanks, and technical equipment for a multi-pronged survey.
In weeks to come, we will range the entire island and its underwater environment. We will traverse the almost roadless landscape by horse, despite the mutual distrust. We will climb the precipitous cliffs that rise as high as 600 feet in a bastion against the sea, explore the caves that tunnel the porous volcanic rock almost everywhere. For a bird's eye view, I will take to the air in a complete search of possible clues to the island's true story. The Zodiac, the diver's rubber support craft, is carefully ready for the rough coastal waters of Rapa Nui. For aerial surveys, a dismantled gyrocopter is brought to the island and is there assembled. On it, a local artist paints an appropriate symbol, the figure of Tangata Manu, or so-called Birdman, whose cult dominated the island for 200 years after the overthrow of the great stone figures in the 17th century. Strapped into the skeletal craft, I prepare to test the gyrocopter on its maiden flight. Beneath me, ceremonial platforms, or ahus, line the forbidding coast. Built with great and prolonged labor, their meaning and function are still unclear. Though at some, there are evidence of crematoriums for the burning of the dead. Some scholars have speculated that the stone figures may have been transported around the island on reed boats, on the theory that if such a method had been used, some statues surely would have been lost in the sea. We prepare to search the bottom. Beneath the surface, all is still. At first, our pearlescent lights reveal little, only a ghostly emptiness. Almost in surprise, we touch the sandy bottom, the submerged platform 30 to 40 fathoms deep, which extends outward for several miles before it drops to the abyssal depths of the Pacific. The shapes that loom from the bottom seem vaguely familiar. For an instant, we believe we may have found the sunken statues for which we are searching. But closer examination reveals no more than the eroded block of volcanic tufa encrusted with sea growth. Though the legend persists that Easter Island is the remaining fragment of a sunken continent, all evidence indicates that it is volcanic in origin, built up by successive eruptions from the ocean floor. On shore, crossing the barren landscape, the members of the team sometimes have an eerie sense of having moved backward in time. As it might to detectives studying the furnishing of an abandoned room, the past abruptly becomes present. Shadowy, forgotten events, again palpable and real. In this sunlit vacancy, we seem to hear the clamor of voices dead for 1,000 years.
Everywhere, like hurried prayers, lies an illustrated litany of stone. Petroglyphs of birdmen and flowers, of fish and turtles, of 100 other fantastic shapes and figures. Clearly, the caves that honeycomb the porous volcanic rock were made to serve some human purpose. In most of the 200 caverns explored, the team finds skeletons and relics. Professor De Silva explains that as the island was progressively denuded of its timber and wood became scarce, the increasing population was forced to make its homes in natural shelters, living and dying in this and similar caves scattered throughout the island.
On y est à peu près. La caméra est prête.
Puzzled by the fact that an island which once supported thousands today cannot sustain a population of 1,600, Cousteau investigates possible causes. Among them, the possibility that there was once a shift in the level of the island. With other team members, he prepares to study the surrounding sea floor.
As we leave the support craft suspended at the surface above us, it is quickly apparent that the shelf around the island is a submerged desert, as if somehow the impoverishment of the land above were a cancerous disease spreading its domain outward farther and farther, year by year. Here and there, a few fish move through the depths, yet without a surrounding reef, as in other Pacific atolls, they must have been very difficult for the early settlers to catch. Beneath the sea, grottos and caves reach back into the rock, sometimes rising above sea level, trapped pockets of air in the congealed mass. They are much like the chambers explored from the surface of the island, subterranean channels formed as the volcanic tufa cooled. Yet, in one particular, they are totally different. The caverns approached beneath the surface hold no sign of human habitation. Clearly, they were submerged long before the first people came to Rapa Nui. Again, as in 100 other places in the past, I am reminded that the Earth is a living body, an interlocking system of delicately balanced forces, endlessly changing, the sea and the cliff, the tree and the desert. Perhaps here on Easter Island, as elsewhere, man intruded upon a natural process, discovered too late that in nature, the injuries we inflict are not always self-healing or even curable.
Even from the air, the island now seems poor and arid, with sparse vegetation and only a few trees planted here and there since its rediscovery. Yet there are many evidences that the earliest arrivals found flourishing woodlands. When traced or rubbed by crayon, the petroglyphs themselves reveal images of flowers and large trees which once were common. Professor De Silva tells Cousteau what the vegetation must have been in early times.
The flowers and the tea.
And the tree.
And the tea is the only tea and the only flowers in the old petroglyph of the island, no? This is beautiful. No? And very important for the history. No?
I think so.
Yes.
It's a big tree.
Yes, it's a big tree.
And when the island was rediscovered, there were practically no tree left.
Yes.
At the Island Museum, Dr. Malloy describes other valuable artifacts, all made of wood.
Of course, one of the most remarkable things about Easter Island is the fact that it demonstrates a characteristic very definitely on the borders of civilization, and so unusual as to be almost unique in a context of this kind. These people had a written language, which they inscribed on wooden tablets, such as the ones that we have here. This, of course, is a hieroglyphic language. It's never been deciphered completely, although some very fine linguists are working on it. And we really don't know what it says, but it represents one of the real mysteries of Easter Island. Not only the fact of its existence, but why a community as small as this one would have needed a written language.
And they are printed on both sides, engraved on both sides.
On both sides. In a very curious way, incidentally, which is called reversed boustrophodon. You start out here with the first line of characters, right side up, run to the end of the line, then the line continues upside down and in the opposite direction. So the tablet is read this way. Curiously enough, then when you read it, you have to read the first line, turn it upside down for the second line, turn it back again right side up for the third line, and so forth. The reading is a continuous process of reversing the tablet.
Sometimes burned as fuel or as vestiges of paganism, few writing tablets remain today. Perhaps used as storytellers' cue sheets, their minutely carved hieroglyphs bear a striking resemblance to written symbols from the Indus Valley in southern Asia. The riddles are hardly less impenetrable than the fog, which now, with the changing season, entraps the exploring team. Isolated by sea and space, the island now is trapped in a cycle of storms. The camp threatened by the buffeting wind, Jacques Cousteau sends a worried summons to the men in the field. Swiftly, the men return, anchor the tents, secure the camp. Similarly, the early settlers on this lonely shard of land must have dug in against the weather, but they could not secure against a greater threat, themselves. Prisoners of each other, isolated and unable to keep peace within their minute world, the islanders could only dream of escape. Its symbol, a birdman fashioned after the Manutara, a far-ranging tern. In it, after the overthrow of the giant figures, the people found a new cult, a new tyranny of the strongest. To the offshore island where the Manutara nested went an annual race for power. Here at Orongo, the chief whose swimmer brought back the first egg was made the birdman for the ensuing year.
Do you have any idea the size of these people?
Well, they were very, very tall.
They were very tall?
Polynesians are one of the tallest races.
Dr. Gonzalo Figueroa tells Philippe of the birdman cult.
The chiefs and the priestesses of the different lineages used to come here every year by the beginning of the spring. And they stayed here while their representative of these chiefs, went to the islands in front here. Those representatives, which were the best swimmers, had to get the first egg of the Manutada, which is the Suji tern, while the chiefs and the priestesses were having ceremonies here, which were connected with the cult of fertility. The swimmers waited until one of them managed to get the first egg. Then he swam back, and his chief would become immediately the Tangatamanu, or the birdman. That gave this man and his lineage or tribe a lot of power, magic and religious power, which they used to make war to other lineages and other tribes. These other tribes and lineages were very much scared of the special power this chief obtained by becoming the Tangatamanu, or birdman.
Was that the beginning of the history of the island?
No. Apparently this cult had the biggest importance by the time the old culture, the old forms, the old gods were in decadence. The former, the highest god was Makemake, who was the god of natural forces, the creator god.
Today, no islander can remember the names of all the gods who once thronged their pantheon of deities, many of whom assumed the shapes of plants or animals. The image of Makemake, most powerful and familiar of the early gods, here is taken from a stone in a dubbing process illustrated by Robert Kroll. Unlike many primitive peoples, the Easter Islanders had no devil or Satan, no god of evil. That, they believed, they brought upon themselves. They could only pray to escape the human evil around them. As if sheer repetition would give reality to their clamoring hopes, the island's rocks now were crowded with petroglyphs of the birdman.
Architecture of the type represented by the large open-air altars that we see being restored here has a considerable antiquity on Easter Island. The earliest radiocarbon date that we have for any of these structures is 690, years after Christ. And it represents one in which most of the details of the local architecture and local stylization are already well formed. So we would expect that architecture of this kind probably dates some centuries before this. It appears to have started out in a rather modest way from prototypes, maraes that is, known very widely in Polynesia, but to have undergone on this island a rather unusually intense fluorescence. Certainly the most remarkable religious building compulsion that we find anywhere in Polynesia. As time went on, these structures became more and more frequently made. Eventually, they lined all the coast of the island. Many statues were placed on them. And finally, some of them spilled over into the interior. It was an architectural fluorescence then that increased in intensity through time until sometime late in the 1600s, when the largest statues were being carved and the largest open-air altars were being made. And at this time, for reasons that are still somewhat obscure, the island seems to have blown up in a blaze of internal warfare, perhaps because of the demands made by the priestly class for aku construction, for statue carving, the transportation of statues, the building of aku, and all of the ceremonial life associated with them. In any event, it seems to have ended about this time, and most of these structures were destroyed and their characteristic covered up by piles of stone.
Wasting energies on totally useless production, exhausting natural resources, confronting overpopulation and food shortage, the island's social order collapsed. In violence and chaos, the great images, symbols of an older and now hated order, were cast down, their necks broken.
Well, in this period of depletion of the natural resources and of heavy population, that as I was telling you, correlates with the period in which this cult took place. Conditions of life were really very hard on the island. People were fighting each other, and this meant that a quite big increase in cannibalism took place. People were hunting people all the time. The areas for fishing, the areas for cultivation were very much well fixed, and the people belonging to one lineage or one family were watching that their resources were respected and not intruded by others. And when others intruded, well, they were killed and eaten.
The greatest relic still remains in the quarry at Rano Raraku.
This is the largest statue in the quarry, about 22 meters long, and it weighs of the order of about 400 tons. Certainly a remarkable job. I think this may very well have been the one that when the workers saw it, they said, "This is enough. No more."
That's too much for them.
This may have been the thing that caused the whole disintegration of the statue code.
And you think the reason why the civilization ended up abruptly was because of that? Because
I think it finally reached a crisis on this particular level. And the culture had to change in order to survive. And it apparently did, with the development of a new religious cult that appears to have been considerably easier to support. The cult of the Manutara, the bird cult.
The birdman.
The birdman cult.
Because often the traces of prehistory are more visible from the air than on the ground, Philippe makes frequent aerial tours of the island. After weeks of exploration, he again takes off on a reconnaissance. But this time, the flight will end in personal disaster. With engine failure at 300 feet, Philippe and the gyrocopter crashed to Earth not far from the island's leper colony. There, found by the lepers, Philippe is finally brought to medical assistance. Later, in the twilight, Michael Sullivan and Dominique Soumian come to examine the crash site. The gyrocopter lies shattered beyond repair, a memento that human technology, no less than other gods, can also fail. Hardly less injured, Philippe Cousteau will survive, and after repeated medical intervention on the mainland, mend and again be almost as good as new. His work nearly completed, he leaves, ironically by air. The island whose inhabitants, caught in a wider tragedy, once dreamed of a similar escape. Even the sea, which had kept them chance prisoners, today is more open to the divers than it was to them. Now, without Philippe, the team descends for a final reconnaissance of the underwater world whose food resource was progressively denied the islanders as wood for boats became scarcer and finally unobtainable. On land, another world was coming to an end as men slaughtered each other in hunger and hatred. But here in these submerged pastures of the sea, there still remained at least an illusion of some calm and natural order. Here too, predator and prey exist side by side in ever-fluctuating balance. Instinctual partisans who, unlike man, seldom escape their role. But fish do not build cathedrals.
So I'm about to leave, and I'm pretty sad.
Well, this island has a sad story to tell in many ways. It's the whole picture, of course, of an advanced culture that developed in remarkable isolation and came, of course, within a hair's breadth of destruction.
Spectral figures on the barren landscape, the giant statues once may have conferred mana or spiritual power from some ancestor upon his clan descendants. But mana requires belief, and today there are no believers on Easter Island. Mindless relics of a faith that failed, their eyes mirror neither memory nor hope.
History is filled with melancholy parables, and Easter Island is one of them. A reminder that the resources of our island Earth are no less finite, a reminder that man's unparalleled creative gift seems fatally linked to its own self-destruct mechanism. Here in the endless sea, a vagrant cell of human life anchored itself, created a civilization, and vanished, leaving a handful of survivors with no conscious recollection that it had ever happened. Yet, if man is at least in part invented by himself, if living generations were born out of the imaginations of men long dead, then the choices remain. Shall we, islanders no less than they, pass on the riches of human invention and wisdom to living inheritors, or to mindless relics that mock all that was possible? Perhaps the islanders were right. We are not victims of a god of evil. We are victims only of the evil we bring upon ourselves.
Lost in the immense solitudes of the Pacific, its coral atoll a mere 2 miles in diameter, Clipperton Island seems an inconsequential landfall. Marked by a single volcanic outcrop, its circular rim of land is barely visible at sea level. Ringed by heavy surf, the island offers no shelter to passing ships, only a trap. Yet upon this barren shore, life has seized a foothold. Uncounted birds have made it their nesting ground. Here, hordes of crabs have become the island's most tenacious residents. In this stark world, the crab is both scavenger and king. He serves a simple mandate: survival. Human beings have come and gone, leaving mute evidence of their troubled presence. Living witnesses still echo a past of abandonment and terror and violent death. He had hit us so much. He had beat us so much. Cut off from the sea by geologic upheavals, the lagoon has become a unique laboratory for the study of adaptation. Remote, desolate, Clipperton remains a merciless ground in which each species plays an endlessly changing drama of life and death. To the rich and the restless, the resort hotels of Mexico's Pacific coast offer a languid retreat. Among Manzanillo's pools and bars and boutiques, any tourist can find an easy refuge from stress, quickly forget the world's headache. 670 miles to the southwest, Clipperton Island also is a world apart. Appropriately shaped like a cipher or zero, it offers no luxuries at all. Difficult to visit by sea, Clipperton ordinarily is hazardous to reach by air. To permit ready access for Captain Cousteau and a three-nation scientific team, a temporary airstrip has been cleared on the Coral Flat, the domain of the imperturbable gannet, or booby. Disembarking from the Canadian seaplane, Cousteau is greeted by colleagues Soumian, Delamotte, Delcouter, and Dr. Pierre Niosa, who has led intermittent studies of Clipperton's geology and life systems. Its lagoon now closed to the sea, the island offers no proper anchorage. Thus, the supply ship must stand well offshore, while tons of material and even men are transferred to land by helicopter airlift. Though the island now boasts 2 small coconut groves sprung from trees planted nearly a century ago, almost every necessity must be brought to its barren ring of gravel. A generator, food, medical supplies, a small tractor to move scientific equipment. Drums of fuel and even water must be stored for the French, Canadian, and American members of the joint scientific mission. Watched by the local residents, the red-footed boobies and the crabs, the new intruders explore their tiny world. They are not the first. Here have come conquistadors, pirates, and Yankee whalers. About the island's narrow rim is scattered the debris of shipwrecked fishermen, of guano poachers, of military missions which have left supply dumps or even an abandoned French camp. Now French, the island's possession was long contested by Mexico, which in 1908 established a small garrison under Captain Arnaud, accompanied there by his young bride. Barely 6 years later, as World War began and revolution swept Mexico, Arnaud rejected an offer of evacuation by an American ship. Today in Mexico, Arnaud's son, Ramon, and the family maid, Altagracia, then 19, recall the fateful decision. Captain Arnaud didn't wish to abandon his post. I told him the food was running out. The food was running out. The captain's son, Ramon, tells of their 3-year abandonment, of the supply ship that never came. There were 15 deaths. The others also were dying little by little. Then they progressively got worse, and the few medicines there were, well, they ran out. The Mexican garrison long forgotten, the Lighthouse Rock remains a solitary landmark of the survivors' ordeal. The treacherous surf that hemmed them in still maintains its steady assault against the land. Even today, guiding the Zodiac through the breakers, the Cousteau team finds it a difficult passage caused by the island's structure. Like a crown on a submerged volcano, the coral reef extends from shore in a shallow shelf against which the waves break incessantly, usually creating an impossible barrier for small boats. Not until the team is past the surf line, where the island's underwater flanks drop steeply, can Cousteau and his companions, Delamat, Danfan, and Delcouter, safely enter the sea.
100 yards away, Clipperton is a bitter battleground of a few surviving species. Here, dolphins play. Here, a manta ray drifts by, unhurried, the image of lordly self-assurance. Here, the waters swarm with life. Also, the flat coral structures offer limited shelter from predators. An unending procession of marine species swims by. Tropical fish of all kinds, large schools of Jacques. Here and there, an occasional trumpet fish. Dense populations of quarrelsome moray eels, sometimes as many as 2 or 3 to a square yard. A school of yellow goatfish routinely swerves aside for the passage of a small shark. Around us, more sharks appear. Hard to approach, they arch their backs in a distinctive movement, warning us to stay away from their mobile, three-dimensional territory. Now in the hundreds, the hammerheads pass overhead in a vast armada. Swimming to the surface in frenzied escape from bigger ones, schools of small fish fall victim to another waiting predator, the boobies. Now the boobies themselves must run an aerial gauntlet of frigates trying to steal their fish. Those which elude the frigates are soon relieved of their catch by the voracious chicks. But even as the chick feeds, another presence waits its turn. The red land crab that will instantly seize any unguarded morsel. It, too, soon must try to ward off rivals determined to join the feast. But in the circular food chain from sea to air to land, there is yet another link. At Clipperton, the moray eels often patrol the shoreline itself in search of food, sometimes venture surprising distances on land to seize their prey. The circle is closed. The sea, which fed the bird, which fed the crab, has again balanced accounts, taken back its own.
Since its discovery by Spanish conquistadors, approaching visitors have been astonished by Clipperton's vast, clamoring flocks of birds, flying like a banner above the island. The terns and boobies, and in season, the piratical frigates who plunder the others of their catch. By tacit agreement, each species has sharply defined property rights, zones where the terns and boobies make their nests. Though eggs are scattered by the thousands upon the bare coral, each tern unerringly finds its own, so inflexibly programmed in its instinctual actions that not infrequently one will try to hatch a hopelessly damaged egg. The birds may soar, but it is the indigenous land crab that holds the ground. No larger than a man's hand, sensitive to heat, the crabs avoid the sun, digging holes and underground galleries, or seeking refuge under palms, bits of wreckage, or anything which offers even a measure of protection. Heedless of privacy, they form in layers, walls of living creatures. So numerous that it sometimes has been described as a vast vermilion carpet. The crab will eat anything soft or unprotected. Its waking life is a ceaseless quest for food. As sundown approaches, the crabs become active. Intent on making the acquaintance of one crab, Cousteau briefly plays a game of now you see it, now you don't. But quickly the crab decides the moving fingers are something edible. More successful is this foraging crab, which is made off with a booby's egg. Usually laying 2 eggs each year, kept under incessant siege by the crabs. It is said that the booby will sometimes yield one egg as tribute, and thus, under a kind of gentleman's agreement, gain immunity for the other. With luck, the booby's egg has broken as it was dragged over the jagged coral. When it does not, the crab itself becomes a kind of surrogate parent, patiently waits for the egg to hatch, then devours the baby chick. Yet from the island's pitiless rule of natural selection, there is no appeal. The weak die, the strong survive. Because a booby's 2 eggs usually hatch several days apart, the firstborn is accordingly stronger, frequently drives out the younger chick under the impartial eye of the mother. Relentless as hunger, the crabs move in. Moved by the plight of the evicted chicks, Jacques of the Cousteau team decides to try an experiment.
Voyez, c'est terrible, hein? Je vais absolument le chasser. Voilà.
To Cousteau, he explains that he proposes to place the weaker chick, almost certainly doomed to die, in a nest with only one unhatched egg, hoping the surrogate mother will adopt the foundling. Finding a suitable nest, Ertaud pushes aside the booby parent as he carefully places the chick beside the egg, then awaits the response.
Il a l'air surprise, mais pas agressive. Le petit poussin a envie de se mettre sous cette nouvelle mère.
After considerable hesitation, the booby parent at last accepts its new family member. Snug under its foster mother's feathers, the chick confidently awaits its first meal. At another site, a crab has begun his siege, boldly testing the patience of the parents guarding their nest. Joined by other crabs, it works its way ever closer to the chick and egg, protected by the mother's body. Nervously, the booby hen rises, exposing the chick. Instantly, the crabs dart in to seize the newly hatched victim. But this time, the action does not follow the usual plot. The booby parents counterattack. Even the crab's hard carapace is insufficient defense against the rapid-fire thrusts of the booby's powerful beak. Unerringly, the booby's beak has found the chink in the crab's armor. Its damaged claw the price of the ill-fated attack on the nest. This crab, also badly hurt, simply performs a quick battlefield surgery, amputates its own claw. It will be regenerated in the next several molting cycles. The crab's ravenous appetite makes no finicky distinctions, readily dines on friend or foe. Yet despite his willing cannibalism, the crab observes the usual constraints within a single species, never attacks and kills one of his own kind. In its incessant feeding, the crab has denuded the island of all vegetation except the few established trees. It will ingest anything its claws can tear and carry to the mouth. Yet in this bleak battleground for survival, it also performs a necessary scavenger role. Picked clean by the crabs, the booby's bones now will be dissolved, recycled by sun and storm. In this stern economy, nothing is wasted. Day by day, the scientists pursue their study of the atoll's volcanic origins, its changing marine biology, the strict limitations the island's harsh environment imposes on the life forms it will sustain. In the improvised laboratory set up in the former French camp, biologist René Taxit shows Cousteau both fresh and saltwater samples. They reveal that though limited in its variety of life forms, the lagoon is far richer in plankton than is the sea. Displaying a lump of dead coral, geologist Bourrouille tells Cousteau that because of the abrupt transition from a saline environment, the lagoon provides a unique opportunity to study the impact of fresh water on the once thriving coral reef. Visible from the air as a dark stain in the lagoon is the deep hole, possibly the vent of a submerged volcano, which long has aroused the particular curiosity of many of the scientists. Cousteau crosses the lagoon to the diving platform placed directly above the sunken crater of the volcano. There, with Delamont and Soumillon, he prepares for an exploratory descent into the vent itself. For the dive, Cousteau has brought special equipment. Anticipating difficult conditions in the lagoon, he has developed a rectangular cone filled with clear water and fixed ahead of the camera lens to permit filming in disturbed or murky conditions below the surface. In the dive itself, Cousteau and Jacques Delcouter and Bernard Delamotte have put aside their regular diving suits. Instead, each now wears a watertight unisuit and protective mask. Finally, all preparations complete, Bernard enters the water. Delcouter and Cousteau quickly follow.
The journey begins. Above us, for an instant, hangs a rectangle of sunlight, the window through which we have slipped from one element to another. Then it is gone. I test my camera and the cone shielding the lens against the murkiness of the surrounding water. An apparition looms into view, and I think I recognize Bernard. He signals, and a moment later the lights reveal the inner wall of the crater covered by vegetation. At this level, we still are in a zone of life. Slowly, we continue our descent along the weighted cable, our single reference point as we move into the increasing darkness. Gradually, the character of the water around us seems to be changing, both in temperature and chemical composition, giving it a glycerin-like appearance. Then, at 60 feet, the lights reveal what appears to be the bottom. Instead, it proves to be a dense 4-foot layer of accumulated plant detritus, a thickly matted net in which material falling from the surface is quickly trapped. Through it, Delcouter vanishes, and for a moment all we can see are the air bubbles rising from his breathing apparatus. Then we too pass through the floating layer. Around us, great blobs of matter float by, strange constellations, drifting through a space in which all familiar landmarks have ceased to exist. We seem to have entered a world of dream, ghostly and insubstantial, in which the cable has become the only thread connecting us to reality. Out of the depth, an outcrop appears. From it, our slightest movement lifts little storms of settled particles, the dead chaff of once living matter. Deeper. In this submerged desolation, the water temperature again seems to rise, burning our hands in spite of our gloves. We take samples, hoping later to learn what chemical changes have occurred at successive levels. Now, at nearly 100 feet, we pass through a second suspended layer, enter a silent chaos in which masses of ruptured material move around us, more sensed than seen. Slowly we are enveloped in total darkness. It is only with our flippers that we finally feel the bottom. Earlier, our hands seemed scalded by the water. Now, despite our watertight suits and masks, our eyes are burning. Tears pour down our faces, blurring our vision. The pain is unbearable. I signal our return. I know now that it is not heat that is burning us. It is hydrogen sulfide, the toxic product of vegetation rotting when all oxygen has been consumed. We have penetrated a zone of death, a region where no living thing can long survive. Blinded and burned, we begin an ascent that seems endless. Eager to hurry, to escape this hostile inferno, we still must obey the diver's discipline, return to the surface at a carefully prescribed pace. Slowly, hand over hand along the cable, we rise through the successive layers toward clearer water at the top. A glow of light at last appears from the platform's rectangular well. It is no longer simply a window in the sky. It is deliverance.
As they reach the surface, Delcouter urgently splashes his face to wash away the chemical, but it is Delamotte who has suffered most. More of the hydrogen sulfide has seeped into his mask, and now he cannot open his eyes. As Cousteau removes his mask and unshackles his air cylinders, he too is in distress. Yet despite the severe discomfort the divers have experienced in their descent to the bottom of the vent, Cousteau reports that the dive was well worth the effort. Souvenir of their journey, a piece of dead coral has been brought from the bottom for scientific examination. Later, cleansed of the burning liquid, Cousteau and his companions describe their uncontrolled tears as the sulfide invaded their masks. Even the air tanks have changed from yellow to olive green. Yet above the hostile depths, the crabs thrive and multiply. Here they leave their spawn, feed on algae, absorb essential moisture through hair on legs and body. With nightfall, the roving birds return to Earth, seek the quiet of the nest. But the crabs awake. Now a monstrous crawling army searches the darkened island for food. Yet, like other species, the crab seems doomed never to win more than a temporary victory, to remain a mechanism in some changing design it cannot conceive. For Raymond Arnaud, son of the former garrison commander, the design has offered an unexpected journey. Bidding goodbye to his daughter and wife in Manzanillo, he prepares to return to the island he has not seen in more than 6 decades. In brief hours, Raymond crosses the distance that once seemed hopelessly impassable, but which in memory he has crossed 1,000 times.
Attention au chapeau, il va s'envoler. Ouais.
Bien. Bueno, aquí está.
Venez. Attention, hein.
Vale.
Buenos días.
Bueno.
Bonjour Bernard.
¿Usted sabe dónde
está?
Sí.
¿Sí?
En la isla Clipperton.
Ah.
Gracias.
C'est Don
Sí,
Ramon.
en mi tierra. Oh.
My earth, says Raymond. Around him spreads the circle of land where he was born. The boobies remain, the surf, the great rock, and yet something eludes him.
Attendez, venez voir. Vous voyez les cocotiers?
Les cocotiers, donde están los...
Quand il y était, il y en avait 2.
Hein?
Now with Cousteau, Ramon moves again through the coconut grove that once saved himself and 10 other survivors from death by scurvy.
Ahí teníamos toda la colonia.
Emerging from the trees, Ramon again tries vainly to get his bearings, to find his way back to the reality that was. For a moment, the past seems an illusion. He seeks a familiar structure or landmark, something, but they are gone. The familiar houses of his boyhood, the strong, erect figure of his mother, the boy he was, now a distant stranger.
Do you remember your father? Mi padre? Poco.
To Cousteau's question, Ramon says he remembers little, only that he was big and tall with a Kaiser mustache and a helmet with a big eagle, that he dressed in the German or Austrian style.
O austriaco.
Part of Ramon's earliest memories is the great threatening surf, forever associated with his father. For a little while, he searches the beach, trying to remember the moment in 1915 when his life and the life of all the others on the island was changed forever.
Mi padre murió pa allá, a donde se ve dorado.
My father died over there, where the ship was passing. He and the other 3 men, they all died there.
Ahí estaba esperando mi padre que le dieran de comer.
We lived in the little house. My father had just finished his meal, and my sister was outside playing. Then she ran in and told him, "Papa, Papa, a ship." And then he ran out and saw it.
Y vio para afuera y dice sí, y entonces comenzó a gritarle, Cardona.
He began to yell, "Cardona, Ira, Rodriguez, a ship, let's go." They took the little boat, a ship's boat, and went. Standing near the high flag, my mother was watching with the telescope. The ship didn't carry a flag. She watched and watched and watched. The little boat went back and forth in the waves until I think the men could not control it, or the oars broke. My mother started to tell us, to cry. It was a tragedy, big emotions. We were all crying. Within hours, a great storm broke over the island, inundating much of its narrow strip under mountainous seas. Now bereft of every able-bodied man but one, Alvarez, the lighthouse keeper, Madame Arnaud and 9 surviving women and children huddled under the floor of her house, fearful the winds would sweep it away. Then, as the storm passed, Madame Arnaud gave birth to a son, her 4th and last child. Stunned, the little band began its 2-year struggle to survive. But now from the rock, a new and unexpected terror began. Gathering all the guns, the lighthouse keepers seized rule over the survivors, brutally demanded the services of the women, raping and shooting a mother and daughter who refused him. Declaring no woman would leave the island alive, Alvarez counted his potential victims. Tirza, who submitted but promised to kill him. 13-year-old Rosalia. Altagracia, first of his victims. Madame Alicia Arnaud, his last intended mistress. It was in mid-July of 1917, says Ramon, when the lighthouse keeper came to the big house and said to Madame Arnaud, "You are going to live with me." But the mother made no reply because Alvarez was armed. It was then that Tirza said, "Now is the time." Dawn of July 18, 1917, was little different from other mornings. Already the birds were beginning to hunt. Soon the heat of the day would come. At 11 o'clock, Madame Arnaud and Tirza, with young Ramon, started the walk to the keeper's house. Ramon tells Cousteau what happened. Here was the first house, the other house here. Alvarez was sitting in the doorway on one side, and we were on this side. My mother here. Teresa stood near the edge of the window that faced that way. She moved away from the window, but when she reached Alvarez, he lifted his head and said to her, "What are you doing here? Go do your things." Teresa went then to the corner by the trunk. She had left the hammer there, and she went back to get it. My mother told her to go ahead. Teresa struck, like this, with the hammer again. He fell. My mother shoved me away. I started to go inside, and then again he was standing. He took an axe and went at my mother. My mother grabbed him and held on. My mother shouted for me to go to the other side and bring a can of petrol to burn Alvarez.
Yes. Yo salí corriendo aquí.
I began to run, but when I got over there, I saw the ship,
Yorktown.
the Yorktown.
Me vine así, pero no aguanté.
I came back, and Teresa asked me what was going on. I told her, a ship, a ship.
Le dije, barco, barco. Entonces,
What will happen? What will happen? Sent to check for enemy Germans, the astonished Yorktown crew instead found women who had just killed a man, stranded children in ragged sailcloth sacks to whom privation and hunger seemed utterly normal. 11 survivors of a prolonged human catastrophe. Now their ordeal and Ramon's early boyhood were finished. Today, the events of that boyhood are part of vanishing history, little remembered by any but 2 aging survivors, Ramon and his one-time nursemaid, Altagracia. Yet now, before he returns from his visit to the past, Ramon Arnaud leaves one memento, one symbol of peace for the father he so briefly knew.
A cross stands in the sunlit silence, brief token that man was here. In a last tour of the island, Erto and I encounter other rusted evidence of man's brief, ill-fated intrusions. In this stern, minute world, only the crabs and a few bird species thrive. Here, other creatures, including man, have little place. Yet, by a harsh irony, man himself is steadily reducing the diversity of life on his planet. He is creating a world hostile to all but the hardiest species, a world hostile even to himself. Another Clipperton. Yet to this bleak outpost, waves have brought a ball no child will play with. Nearby, we come upon other artifacts that on this alien shore seem at once familiar and puzzling. A little boat. A toy soldier. Dismembered dolls. the bits and pieces of human existence.
Des ampoules électriques, des bouteilles, et des crabes partout. Moi, j'ai gardé ça en tout cas. Et puis alors, tout ça au milieu des munitions laissées par les Américains.
Even unspent ammunition, salvaged from a wreck and then abandoned. In this cosmic theater of the absurd, perhaps it is the crab that may survive, not we. In this rigorous testing ground, he has had no choice but to strive or die. He is unencumbered by thought, or compassion, or love, or hate. He has no myth, sings no songs, and never plays with dolls.